As a co-founder and now director of the Documentary Accountability Working Group, or as we call it, DOG, and a newbie at the Hot Springs Documentary Film Festival, it's really an honor to have the opportunity to address all of you in this room. Thanks to Ken Jacobson, Ashley York, and Emily Cooper for the invitation. For those of you who are not familiar with DOG or our work, the group also includes my stellar colleagues, many of whose names you may recognize. Co-founder, co-director of Color Congress, Sonia Childress, co-director of Youth FX, Bawin Suchak, Working Films co-director Molly Murphy, Sherry Simpson, a senior director at ITVS, clinical psychologist Dr. Camila Mumin Oseguera, who's formerly known as Dr. Rashad, professor and researcher Patricia Aufderheide, and last but not least, Hannah Hearn, also of Working Films. DOG came together organically in early 2020, pre-pandemic. We tossed our hat into the ring of a long-standing documentary field ethics conversation with an initial offering, a piece that Sonia Childress and I co-wrote called The Documentary Future, a Call to Accountability. DOG was troubled by long-standing issues of inequity and extraction that existed in the field and still persist, and that were flourishing in the new commercial era at the time, dominated by streamers. Our vision was aspirational. We wanted to articulate a praxis that was in alignment with the practices of many filmmakers already organically using a values-based approach. Then George Floyd was murdered. The same month, the documentary Future piece Sonia and I wrote was released, and soon this country was in the midst of a racial reckoning. As a result, we found that people throughout the doc field, especially filmmakers, were increasingly interested in engaging in conversations about ethics and accountability in their filmmaking practice. So DOG created a set of 6 values that have guided our work ever since. These values are: 1, integrate anti-oppression practices into your work; 2, be transparent in your relationships; 3, acknowledge your positionality; 4, respect the dignity and agency of the people in your film; 5, prioritize the needs, well-being, and experience of the people associated with your film; and 6, treat all potential audience members with dignity, care, and concern. Then in September 2022, after several years of research, convenings with filmmakers and film participants, and refinement of the values and framework structure, we publicly released into the field, From Reflection to Release, Framework for Values, Ethics, and Accountability in Nonfiction Filmmaking. The structure of the framework follows the familiar phases of documentary filmmaking: research and development, pre-production, production, post-production, and release, impact. However, given what DOG learned from the filmmakers and especially film participants that we recruited for a number of listening sessions, we decided to codify another phase of production, the unseen, unspoken first phase, which we call reflection. And this is what I'd like to focus on for the remainder of my time in front of you. First of all, reflection is something that DOG recognizes just about every filmmaker spends some time engaged in. It's that period when we consider the merits of pursuing a particular story that we think we want to tell. However, what is incredibly helpful about having a clinical psychologist as a part of your working group, at least in our case, was Dr. Oseguera's ability to help us think about the profound impact that the documentary filmmaking process has on film participants and the harm that can result even from filmmakers with the best of intentions when time is not taken prior to undertaking a documentary film to engage in introspection and reflection. In the framework, each phase of production, including reflection, is set off with questions and considerations for filmmakers to think about. As a filmmaker myself, I've been particularly struck by the reflection process because I believe that ample reflection can help filmmakers slow down in order to move at a speed that engenders trust and care with film participants, the production team, and hired crew, and that doesn't rush the storytelling process. But storytelling doesn't only happen in documentary filmmaking. And ironically, the stories we hear from childhood and that are embedded and promoted within political and cultural discourse are the narratives that we can allow to influence our work as documentary filmmakers if we don't spend time getting in touch with those stories and how we might challenge or unwittingly reinforce them before we even pick up a camera. I've written 2 pieces about reflection, in part to process my own understanding of the dog framework and also to reckon with the stories that have impacted my life. One of those think pieces is about my dad, William L. Bullock. It seems fitting that I deliver this keynote today in the South, because in less than a week, it will be the 1-year anniversary of my 86-year-old dad's unexpected passing last October 28th, 2023. My dad was a son of the South, born in Mississippi, and so much of what he experienced throughout his life was coded by what he endured growing up under the racial terror and humiliation of segregation. Last December, a little over a month after my dad passed, I was nearing the end of my time as a documentary film fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Shorenstein Center, and one of my deliverables was an op-ed. All I could do while thinking about what I should write, which ultimately became a piece entitled A True Story of Reflection with Love, was to reflect about my dad and our fraught relationship, the security and safety he found in religion to manage the trauma of a life in which he straddled the containment of Jim Crow and his post-integration hopes for freedom, personally and professionally, the disappointment and heartbreak of dreams dashed by racism and divorce, and how he imposed on me, his only child, a fearful vision of life and what he believed was an inherent inability to manage it all. Reflection and healing in my own life, as well as a desire to understand my trauma and resulting biases against my dad and his impact, helped me to ultimately recognize him as a 3-dimensional human being who deserves to be remembered within the context of his life, and as the late filmmaker Kathleen Prettyman Collins would say, as neither saint nor sinner. I needed that clarity to fully honor the way I tell my dad's story with the love and empathy of an only daughter, but to also be clear-eyed in the stark fact that damaged people damage other people. But rather than pathologizing damaged people, especially if they take responsibility for the harm they cause, as my dad did, it is important to understand the origins of that damage to properly place a person or group of people into context. Understandably, it's far easier to be honest and careful in how we preserve dignity and truth when we're dealing with people with whom we relate because we love and or are in relationship with them. The question is, how do we translate the natural concern we have for how the people closest to us are framed into a concern for how any and everyone is framed, especially when we wield power over them as storytellers, whether we're producing a film, organizing around an issue, or perhaps determining policies and legislation. We live in a country and a world where certain people's lives matter more than others, and that fact is as ubiquitous and evident as the air we breathe. There's a reason why activists and organizers created the phrase Black Lives Matter, not to assert that somehow Black lives matter more than those of others, but to highlight the reality that no matter the gains of the last 60 years, Black people as a demographic are still a vulnerable group subject to grave disparities in maternal and infant mortality rates, disproportionate incidents of state-sanctioned brutality and death, rates of poverty, rates of chronic disease, and so forth. Black people also continue to struggle against hundreds of years of old tropes about our intelligence, intrinsic worth, beauty, perceived hypersexuality, criminality, and violent tendencies, and overall capabilities. And in a time of genocide, not only strikingly in Gaza, but the Congo, Haiti, and many other Black and brown places throughout the world, you know, those so-called shithole countries, it is important to name what we don't always like to acknowledge or discuss, that the narratives we have learned about others who don't live, love, or look like us, the narratives we repeat to ourselves consciously or not, influence us, and the resulting racism, white supremacy culture, xenophobia, Islamophobia, sexism, misogyny, transphobia, homophobia, and anti-Blackness, among other illnesses, can have an insidious effect to the point that if we are not careful, we can embody and even weaponize those phobias and isms against the very people we intend to be lifting up and protecting. While reflection is not a cure-all, it can help us identify our limitations in understanding, as well as what we must address within ourselves. In so doing, we're able to mitigate some of the harm that often comes from a lack of examination of our own lives and our impact on the ones around us, especially those over whom we hold power, and especially those whose stories we have been entrusted with and given the sacred privilege to tell. In the other piece I wrote about reflection, entitled Considering a Trauma-Informed Approach to Documentary Filmmaking, I try to model what reflection might look like given that sacred privilege. In 2021, I was captured by a tweet from a ProPublica reporter about a story that detailed the systematic criminalization of Black grade school children in rural Tennessee. I thought seriously about making a documentary to highlight the injustice these children were regularly subjected to: routine criminal detention of kids as young as the 2nd grade for minor, if not dubious, offenses, and the way this criminalization traumatized not only the children and their families, but the entire local Black community. But during my reflection process, I considered how I would take care of the potential participants of the film, the children of Rutherford County and their families, and what I would need to know to mitigate harm to the greatest degree. So following the DOG framework, I thought about myself as a filmmaker. Why me? Why should I be the one to take on this film? True, I'm Black and a mom with a heart for Black children, but I'm not a resident of Tennessee, let alone Rutherford County. I also enjoy privileges that that community does not. Does that matter? Should it? What or who would I need to help me tell a story about an experience that isn't my own in a community hundreds of miles from where I live in a way that is just and nuanced and ultimately helpful and impactful to the communities being harmed? I also considered the process of gaining access to the people, including young children, who are at the heart of the Rutherford County story. How would I approach their parents to gain consent to tell their stories? And what would I do if they said no? Would I keep asking, hoping to eventually wear them down? For how long would I pursue them? Would it be traumatizing for me to pursue them at all? Is there a way to pursue without trauma? And isn't persistent pursuit coercion? Ultimately, I realized that I did not have the bandwidth to do the story justice, and that the most appropriate unit of analysis for the story would not have been to focus on and potentially re-traumatize the victims in Rutherford County, but to expose and examine the systems that create the injustice and harm in the first place. DOG's own Dr. Oseguera once said, quote, "The power you wield as a filmmaker or storyteller is all connected to the person you are, your perceptions, biases, etc." DOG and I learned from her that reflection is a good way to confront those perceptions and biases before you pick up a camera, and helps inform the duty of care that DOG encourages all filmmakers to commit to. Cole Arthur Riley, who is one of my favorite Instagram follows, and author of the books This Here Flesh and Black Liturgies, offers particular insight when it comes to reflection. She says, quote, "You cannot care for the world without encountering your own face." And, quote, "At some point, we have to look around to see how the systems of oppression exist in ourselves. Later on today, we'll have the opportunity to hear from the filmmakers behind the incredible American coup, Wilmington 1898, which many of us got to watch last night, and Wild Hogs and Saffron, which I have not yet had the chance to view. What I do know is that these filmmakers leaned into intentional ways of taking care of and collaborating with their film participants after reflecting on the nature of the stories they wanted to tell, and either their distance from or deep personal connection to those stories. Our collective narratives persist because we don't challenge them. In fact, as American Coup so powerfully demonstrates, certain narratives exist because of who gets to tell the story. But if we can slow down and underscore the humanity of our film participants and other collaborators with the same energy that we invest in our own, if, as Cole Arthur Riley suggests, we can encounter our own faces in order to take care of others, then not only can we make beautiful, transformative films that maintain participant dignity while telling the truth, but do so with the least amount of harm. May we all be led in our storytelling by not only reflection, but a cultivated care for the humanity of those who have entrusted us with their stories, a humanity that reflects our own. Thank you.